December 23rd, 1942. The sound that had been sustaining their hope for 11 agonizing days had been growing progressively fainter with each passing hour. Captain Joachim Wieder stood motionless in the frozen ruins of what had once been a functioning tractor factory, straining his ears as he listened to the distant thunder of artillery fire growing softer, then softer still, until finally it faded completely into the wind howling mercilessly across the Volga River. For 3 desperate days, the German soldiers trapped inside the hell of Stalingrad had heard that distant sound growing steadily closer, had allowed themselves to believe with desperate hope that Field Marshal Erich von Manstein's powerful relief force would actually reach them and break the Soviet encirclement. Some optimistic soldiers had even packed their few meager belongings in preparation, ready to break out and meet their approaching rescuers. Now the guns were moving away inexorably, growing more distant with each passing moment, abandoning them to their fate. Wieder would later write in his haunting memoir that this was the precise moment they knew with absolute certainty they were doomed. Not when the Soviets first encircled them a month earlier, not when the supply flights catastrophically failed to deliver enough food to keep them alive, but this specific moment when salvation came within 48 kilometers of their position and then retreated, leaving them to die slowly in the frozen city they'd been ordered to hold at any cost. The trap had closed around them with absolutely shocking speed that caught everyone by surprise. On November 19th, Soviet forces had launched a massive pincer movement striking both north and south of Stalingrad simultaneously, smashing through the Romanian armies that had been protecting the German flanks. Within a mere 4 days, the massive jaws had met, completely encircling the entire German Sixth Army and significant parts of the 4th Panzer Army. Roughly 290,000 men found themselves suddenly cut off from the outside world, trapped in a pocket that stretched 60 kilometers from east to west and 40 kilometers from north to south. At first, many experienced soldiers thought the encirclement was temporary and manageable. They had been in difficult positions before throughout the war. The Wehrmacht had broken out of encirclements previously, had fought its way through Soviet lines, had survived worse winters than this one. General Friedrich Paulus, the commander of the Sixth Army, immediately requested urgent permission to break out while his forces still possessed strength and mobility, while his tanks still had precious fuel, while his men still had adequate ammunition. The gap in Soviet lines was not yet completely solid and could be exploited. But the response from Hitler's headquarters came swiftly and was absolutely inflexible in its orders. Hold position at all costs. Stalingrad was now designated a fortress that could not be abandoned. No retreat would be permitted under any circumstances whatsoever. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring had personally guaranteed with his reputation that the Luftwaffe could supply the entire pocket by air, confidently promising to deliver 500 tons of supplies daily without fail. The Sixth Army would hold their position until relief forces broke through from the outside to rescue them. The soldiers trapped in the pocket desperately tried to believe these reassuring promises. They had been told repeatedly that the Luftwaffe was invincible and unstoppable. They had witnessed with their own eyes what German air power could accomplish when fully committed. 500 tons delivered daily would be tight logistically, but theoretically sufficient to sustain them. They could realistically hold out for weeks if necessary, maybe even months if they were careful. Lieutenant Wilhelm Hoffmann, serving with the 267th Infantry Regiment, wrote in his personal diary with cautious optimism about their situation. He had survived the absolutely brutal street fighting of the previous months against determined Soviet defenders. Surely the High Command knew exactly what they were doing with this strategy. The first supply flights arrived in late November with much fanfare. Juncker's 52 transport planes came lumbering through intense Soviet anti-aircraft fire to land on the makeshift airfields inside the shrinking pocket. The soldiers watched them arrive eagerly, counting the precious crates being unloaded with desperate attention. Those who could perform basic mathematics began calculating immediately and didn't like what they discovered. The planes weren't bringing anything close to 500 tons as promised. They weren't even bringing 300 tons, which was the absolute minimum the Sixth Army required just to survive. On good days, when weather conditions permitted flights and Soviet fighters didn't intercept too many planes, the Luftwaffe managed to deliver perhaps 94 tons total. On bad days, absolutely nothing arrived at all. The gap between Goering's confident promise and the harsh reality on the ground was so vast that soldiers began to wonder seriously if anyone in Berlin understood basic numbers at all. By early December, the rations had been cut drastically, then cut again even more severely. Soldiers who had been receiving adequate food in November were now subsisting on portions that left them constantly hungry and growing weaker. The bread ration shrank day by day. The meat ration shrank to almost nothing. Men began eyeing the horses with new interest born of desperation. There were thousands of horses trapped in the pocket, cavalry mounts and draft animals that had pulled artillery pieces and supply wagons across Russia. As the fodder supplies ran out completely and the horses began to starve alongside the men, the difficult decision was made to slaughter them systematically for meat. It was practical and even necessary for survival. But it also meant giving up mobility forever, giving up any realistic chance of rapid movement should a breakout operation become possible. The brutal cold came down on them like a hammer strike. December in southern Russia brought temperatures that plummeted to 30 degrees below 0 Celsius. German uniforms designed for the milder winters of Central Europe provided woefully inadequate protection against this extreme cold. Soldiers wrapped themselves desperately in whatever they could find, stripping coats from frozen Soviet dead, stuffing newspaper inside their jackets for makeshift insulation, wrapping their feet in rags when their boots fell apart from the cold. Frostbite became epidemic throughout the pocket. Men lost fingers and toes and ears to the merciless cold. Some simply stopped moving entirely, sat down in the snow, and froze to death where they sat. Wilhelm Hoffmann's diary entries grew progressively darker as hope faded. December 11th, quote, 0. December 14th, quote, 1. His handwriting, once neat and precise, became increasingly cramped and shaky as cold and hunger affected him. He was only 23 years old, had believed passionately in the cause, had written earlier with conviction about the necessity of their mission. Now he wrote obsessively about food and cold and the growing certainty that something had gone terribly, catastrophically wrong. Then on December 12th, hope returned suddenly and powerfully. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, one of Germany's most capable and respected commanders, launched Operation Winter Storm, a powerful relief force spearheaded by the elite 6th Panzer Division drove northeast toward the pocket with determination. The plan was elegantly simple and seemed achievable. Manstein would break through Soviet lines from the southwest, while Paulus's forces broke out to meet him from inside the pocket. Together, they would smash through the encirclement and extract the Sixth Army to safety. It was Germany's last real chance to save the trapped soldiers from certain death. The men trapped in the pocket heard about the offensive through sporadic radio communications. Some heard rumors passed excitedly from soldier to soldier. The sound of artillery fire to the southwest grew louder and closer with each passing day. You could hear it clearly during the day, a distant rumbling that meant German tanks were fighting their way toward them. At night, when the wind conditions were right, you could actually see flashes on the horizon. Salvation was coming. They just had to hold on a little longer. Manstein's panzers fought magnificently, driving through Soviet defensive positions with the skill and aggression that had made the Wehrmacht feared across Europe. By December 19th, they had advanced to within 48 kilometers of the pocket's perimeter. 48 kilometers, a distance that tanks could cover in hours under good conditions. Some units inside the pocket were ordered to prepare for breakout operations. Officers briefed their men on the plan with renewed hope. They would attack southwest, punching through the Soviet lines while Manstein attacked northeast simultaneously. They would link up, fight their way out together, and escape this frozen hell. But Hitler's order remained absolutely inflexible. No breakout without explicit permission from the Führer himself. And that permission never came. Hitler insisted stubbornly that the Sixth Army must hold Stalingrad at all costs. Abandoning the city would be a propaganda disaster, would free up Soviet forces for other fronts, would make a mockery of all the German soldiers who had already died taking it. Paulus, trained in rigid Prussian military tradition, would not disobey a direct order from his supreme commander, no matter the consequences. He waited for permission that never arrived. Meanwhile, Soviet forces launched a powerful new offensive against Manstein's exposed flanks. The relief force, already exhausted from its advance, found itself in serious danger of being encircled as well. On December 23rd, Manstein made the agonizing decision to withdraw his forces to save them from destruction. His panzers turned around and fought their way back southwest, away from Stalingrad and the trapped soldiers. The artillery fire that the trapped soldiers had been listening to, that had sustained their hope for 11 desperate days, began to fade away, growing fainter and more distant, then gone entirely. Joachim Wiede remembered standing in the ruins, listening to that terrible silence descending. Other officers stood with him in the cold, no one speaking, everyone understanding perfectly what it meant. The relief force had been their last chance at survival. If Manstein, with his elite panzers and his tactical genius, couldn't break through to them, then no one could possibly save them. They were alone, abandoned, left to die in this frozen hellscape of rubble and ice. The soldiers' reactions varied widely. Some refused to believe it at first, clinging to denial. The artillery would return soon, they insisted desperately. This was just a temporary setback. Manstein was regrouping, would try again with fresh forces. Others accepted the brutal truth immediately and sank into deep despair. A few became openly angry, raging at the high command that had put them in this impossible position, at Hitler, who had ordered them to hold an indefensible position, at Göring, who had promised supplies that never came, but most simply became quiet and withdrawn, focused entirely on the immediate necessities of survival, finding food, staying warm, getting through another day without dying. Wilhelm Hoffmann's diary entries from late December captured the deterioration perfectly. December 26th, quote 2, he was describing the walking dead, men who had given up hope but hadn't yet stopped breathing. The letters told the same heartbreaking story. German soldiers wrote home, though most knew their letters would never be delivered. The Luftwaffe flights that might have carried mail out were fully occupied bringing in ammunition and inadequate food supplies. But men wrote anyway, needing desperately to communicate their reality to someone, anyone who might understand. These letters, thousands of them, were found on frozen bodies after the battle, collected by Soviet forces, later published in collections that provided a chilling window into the pocket's final weeks. One soldier wrote to his wife, quote, 3. Another wrote with barely concealed despair. Quote 4. The Soviet forces, sensing the trapped army's growing weakness, began tightening the noose systematically. They launched probing attacks, testing the German defenses, finding weak points to exploit. The Sixth Army's perimeter began to shrink steadily. Villages and strong points that had been held stubbornly for weeks were abandoned as units pulled back to shorter, more defensible lines. Each withdrawal meant less space, more crowding, fewer resources available. The airfields inside the pocket came under direct Soviet artillery fire, making supply flights even more dangerous and irregular. By early January 1943, the situation had become absolutely catastrophic beyond description. Rations were cut again to starvation levels. Soldiers were receiving perhaps 100 grams of bread per day, barely a few mouthfuls, supplemented by thin soup made from whatever could be found. Horse meat had become a luxury. Some desperate units resorted to boiling leather belts and boots to make a gelatinous substance that provided minimal nutrition, but at least filled empty stomachs. Thousands of men were too weak to fight anymore. They lay in cellars and bunkers waiting to die, lacking even the energy to move or speak. The medical situation was nightmarish beyond comprehension. Wounded men could not be evacuated. The few flights out carried only the most critically injured, and even then, many died before reaching the airfields or froze to death waiting for planes that never came. Doctors operated without anesthesia, their medical supplies completely exhausted. Amputations were performed with whatever tools were available, often just saws. Frostbite cases overwhelmed every aid station. Men with frozen limbs had them cut off without painkillers, biting down on leather straps while surgeons sawed through dead tissue and bone. Wilhelm Hoffmann made his last diary entry on January 11th. Quote 5. His diary was found on his frozen body weeks later. He was one of the roughly 199,000 German soldiers who would die in the pocket or shortly after capture. On January 10th, the Soviet forces launched their final offensive, Operation Ring. 7 entire armies attacked the pocket from all directions simultaneously, supported by thousands of artillery pieces and hundreds of tanks. The German defenses, manned by starving, frost-bitten soldiers with dwindling ammunition, collapsed in sections. The pocket split in two, then fragmented further into isolated pockets. individual units found themselves cut off, surrounded within the larger encirclement, fighting hopeless battles. General Paulus, still following orders, still holding his position, radioed increasingly desperate messages to Hitler's headquarters. His men were dying by the thousands every day. They had no food, no ammunition, no hope. He requested permission to surrender to save the lives of the men still under his command. Hitler's response was to promote him. On January 30th, Paulus was elevated to Field Marshal, the highest rank in the German military. The message was crystal clear. No German field marshal had ever surrendered in history. Hitler was telling Paulus to commit suicide rather than allow himself to be captured alive. Paulus, exhausted and ill, rejected the implicit order. On January 31st, Soviet forces stormed his headquarters in the basement of the Univermag department store. He surrendered himself and his staff. The Northern Pocket, still holding out, received the news with a mixture of relief and resignation. Their commander had surrendered. The pretense was over. They could stop dying for nothing. The last German units surrendered on February 2nd. Roughly 91,000 German and Axis soldiers marched into Soviet captivity, a fraction of the number that had been encircled. The rest were dead, frozen in the ruins of Stalingrad or buried in mass graves. The survivors looked like walking skeletons, their uniforms in rags, their faces hollow with starvation. Soviet soldiers who had fought them for months were shocked by their condition. These weren't the supermen of Nazi propaganda. They were broken men who had been abandoned by their leadership and left to die. The march into captivity was another death sentence for most. The survivors were already weakened by months of starvation and cold. The Soviet Union, itself struggling with massive casualties and supply problems, had limited resources to care for prisoners. The POWs were marched east in columns through the frozen steppe toward prison camps in Siberia. Thousands died on the march. More died in the camps from disease, malnutrition, and despair. Of the 91,000 who surrendered, only about 6,000 would eventually return to Germany, most not until the 1950s. Joachim Wiede survived. He endured years in Soviet captivity, returned to Germany, and spent decades trying to understand what had happened. In his memoir, he described the moment the artillery fell silent as the moment they knew with certainty they were doomed, not the encirclement itself, which could have been broken, not the supply failures, which could have been overcome with a breakout. But that specific moment when Manstein's relief force, having come so close, turned around and left them to die. That was when hope died completely. He also described the varied reactions of his fellow officers and soldiers. Some maintained discipline to the end, continuing to follow orders even when those orders made no sense. Others broke down completely, weeping or raging or simply staring into space. Many became fatalistic, accepting death as inevitable and focusing only on dying with some measure of dignity. A few tried to escape, attempting to slip through Soviet lines individually or in small groups. Almost none succeeded. The Soviet encirclement was too complete, the frozen steppe too vast and unforgiving. The letters found on bodies after the battle revealed what soldiers said when they knew no rescue was coming. One wrote, quote 6, another, quote 7, a third, quote 8. Some letters expressed raw anger. Quote 9, others expressed resignation. Quote 10, a few maintained defiance. Quote 11. The soldiers also talked among themselves in conversations remembered by survivors. They spoke about what they would eat when they got home, elaborate fantasies about meals they would never have. They talked about their families, wondering if their children would remember them. They debated whether it was better to die fighting or to surrender and take their chances as prisoners. They questioned the decisions that had led them to this place, though never too loudly, as criticism of Hitler could still result in execution by the field police who maintained discipline even in the pocket's final days. Some soldiers found dark humor in their situation. They joked bitterly about Göring's promise of supplies, calling the meager rations, quote, 12, quote. They made bitter comments about the Luftwaffe, calling it the, quote, 13, quote, for its failure to deliver on promises. They nicknamed the supply planes, quote, 1-4, quote, because Soviet anti-aircraft fire shot down so many of them. Humor became a coping mechanism, a way to acknowledge the absurdity of their situation without succumbing to complete despair. Religious soldiers prayed. Chaplains held services in frozen bunkers, offering what comfort they could to men facing death. Some soldiers who had never been religious found faith in their final days, seeking meaning or hope in something beyond the material horror surrounding them. Others lost whatever faith they had had, unable to reconcile a loving God with the suffering they witnessed. One chaplain wrote in his diary, quote 15, the officers faced their own crisis. They had been trained to lead, to make decisions, to accomplish missions. But what mission remained when the mission was impossible? How do you lead men when you have no hope to offer them? Some officers maintained the facade of confidence, insisting that relief would come, that they would break out, that somehow they would survive. Others were honest with their men, acknowledging the reality while trying to maintain discipline and order. A few simply broke, unable to cope with the responsibility of leading men to certain death. General Paulus himself became a figure of controversy. Some soldiers respected him for staying with them, for sharing their fate rather than flying out on one of the last planes. Others resented him for not disobeying Hitler's orders, for not ordering a breakout when it was still possible. After his surrender, his name became synonymous with failure in Germany, though historians would later debate whether he could have done anything differently given the constraints he faced. The moment of surrender brought its own complex emotions. For some, it was relief. The fighting was over. They had survived. They were prisoners, but they were alive. For others, it was shame. They had been taught that German soldiers never surrendered, that death was preferable to captivity. They had failed that standard, even though continuing to fight was pointless. Some felt betrayal, convinced they had been abandoned by leadership that had promised rescue and delivered nothing. Others felt simply numb, too exhausted and traumatized to feel anything at all. The Soviet soldiers who accepted their surrender had their own reactions. Some were sympathetic, seeing starving men who had been victims of their own leadership's incompetence. Others were vengeful, remembering the destruction the Wehrmacht had inflicted on Soviet territory. The civilians killed, the cities burned. Most were simply professional, processing prisoners efficiently, separating officers from enlisted men, searching for intelligence and documents. In the years after the war, survivors struggled to articulate what they had experienced. The physical suffering was terrible, but the psychological trauma was worse. They had been told they were invincible, that Germany would triumph, that their sacrifice had meaning. Instead, they had been trapped, starved, frozen, and abandoned. The promises had all been lies. The relief never came. The supplies never arrived. They had been expendable, sacrificed for a political decision that made no military sense. Joachim Wieder wrote that the worst part wasn't the suffering itself, but the knowledge that it was unnecessary. If Paulus had been allowed to break out in late November, most of the Sixth Army could have been saved. If Manstein had been allowed to link up with Paulus in December, they could have fought their way out together. If Hitler had prioritized his soldiers' lives over his pride and propaganda, hundreds of thousands of men would have lived. Instead, they died in the frozen ruins of a city that had no strategic value, sacrificed to one man's refusal to admit a mistake. The letters, diaries, and testimonies from Stalingrad's final weeks paint a picture of men confronting the ultimate betrayal. They had done everything asked of them. They had fought with courage and skill. They had endured conditions that would have broken lesser soldiers. But their leadership had failed them utterly, making promises it couldn't keep, issuing orders that guaranteed their destruction, prioritizing ideology over survival. When they realized no rescue was coming, when they understood they had been abandoned, their words reflected anger, despair, resignation, and a profound sense of betrayal. One anonymous letter found on a frozen body in the ruins perhaps captured it best. We believed in something greater than ourselves. We trusted that our sacrifices had meaning, that our leaders would not waste our lives needlessly. We were wrong. There is no rescue coming. There never was. We are dying here not because we failed, but because we were failed. Remember us not as heroes, but as a warning. This is what happens when leaders value their pride more than their soldiers' lives. By February 2nd, 1943, the Battle of Stalingrad was over. The city that Hitler had ordered held at any cost had cost him an entire army. The soldiers who had believed rescue was coming had learned the truth too late. Their words, preserved in letters and diaries and memories, serve as testimony to the moment hope died, to the realization that they had been abandoned, to the bitter knowledge that they would die not in victory, but in a frozen wasteland, forgotten by the very nation they had fought for.